Since the dawn of civilization, humanity has engaged in a hidden warfare far more devastating than any clash of swords or cannons. This is not a battle fought on open fields, but in the intimate chambers of trust, in the silent corridors of loyalty, in the sacred space we reserve for those we believe will never harm us. Throughout history, empires have crumbled not from external invasions, but from the treachery of those who stood closest to the throne. Families have been destroyed not by strangers, but by the very blood they thought would protect them. And countless men and women have discovered, too late, that their downfall was orchestrated by hands they once held in friendship. What if I told you that 5 centuries ago a Florentine diplomat, banished and tortured for his political allegiances, sat in exile and decoded the very patterns of human betrayal? That he identified, with surgical precision, the exact archetypes of individuals who, regardless of their promises, their tears, or their seemingly genuine devotion, will inevitably lead you to ruin. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept, that human nature operates according to immutable laws, as predictable as the tides, as certain as gravity. He observed courts and kingdoms, watched allies become executioners, witnessed the righteous fall while the cunning prospered. And from these observations, he distilled a knowledge so potent, so uncompromising, that it has been both revered and reviled for centuries. But here is what most people misunderstand about Machiavelli. They believe he was teaching ruthlessness. They think he advocated for cruelty and manipulation. This is a fundamental misreading. Machiavelli was not prescribing how to be evil. He was describing how evil operates. He was offering a map of the human landscape, pointing to the wolves dressed as shepherds, the serpents coiled in gardens, the smiling faces that conceal calculating minds. You live in a world that tells you to trust, to be open, to assume the best in people. These are beautiful ideals, and in a perfect world, they would be sufficient. But we do not live in a perfect world. We live in Machiavelli's world, a world where power dynamics govern every relationship, where self-interest drives most actions, where the appearance of virtue often masks the reality of vice. Every day you encounter people who fall into the categories Machiavelli identified. They sit across from you in meetings. They share your table at family gatherings. They appear in your social circles, your business networks, your romantic life. And if you cannot identify them, if you lack the discernment to recognize these patterns, you will become their victim. Not because you are weak, but because you are blind. This video is not entertainment. This is not a collection of interesting historical facts to share at dinner parties. What you are about to receive is a survival manual for navigating the treacherous waters of human relationships. By the end of this journey, you will possess a lens through which to view people that will fundamentally alter how you assess character, allocate trust, and protect your interests. The knowledge contained here is dangerous precisely because it is true. Once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand these archetypes, you will recognize them everywhere. And that recognition will demand something from you. The courage to act on what you know, even when it contradicts what you feel. Machiavelli identified 7 distinct types of individuals who, despite their protests of loyalty, despite their demonstrations of affection, despite their promises of fidelity, must never be granted your full trust. These are not simply people with flaws. We all have flaws. These are individuals whose fundamental nature makes betrayal not merely possible, but inevitable. They are structurally incapable of sustained loyalty because their internal architecture will not permit it. Let us begin our descent into these 7 shadows. The first 3 will establish the foundation, teaching you to recognize the patterns that precede betrayal. Then, after we have built this base of understanding, we will proceed to the more subtle, more dangerous archetypes. The ones that even experienced observers of human nature often fail to detect until it is too late. prepare yourself. What follows is the accumulated wisdom of centuries, refined through the lens of one of history's most penetrating minds. This is Machiavelli's eternal warning, and those who ignore it do so at their own peril. The first shadow, the perpetually aggrieved. Listen carefully, for this first archetype is perhaps the most common and therefore the most dangerous through sheer ubiquity. Machiavelli warns us with absolute clarity to never trust the person who defines themselves through their grievances. The individual who carries their wounds like badges of honor. The one who, in every conversation, every interaction, every opportunity, returns to the litany of how they have been wronged, betrayed, underestimated, or victimized. Why does Machiavelli consider this person untrustworthy? The answer lies in understanding the psychology of perpetual grievance. When someone constructs their identity around being wronged, they enter into a particular relationship with the world. They require enemies. They need villains. Their sense of self depends on there being someone or something to blame for their condition. Remove the grievance, and they lose their moorings. They become unanchored, purposeless. Such individuals cannot be loyal to you because their loyalty is already pledged to their narrative of victimhood. And here is the critical insight. That narrative will eventually require your betrayal. It must. Because to maintain their identity as the perpetually wronged, they must continuously produce new evidence of betrayal. You may start as their savior, their champion, the one person who truly understands them. But this role is temporary. Inevitably, you will fail to meet some expectation, commit some perceived slight, or simply exist too contentedly in their presence. And when that moment comes, you will be transformed in their eyes from ally to oppressor, from friend to betrayer. Consider the case of Julius Caesar and Marcus Brutus. Though not in the way you might expect, history remembers Brutus as the noble conspirator, the man who sacrificed personal friendship for the Republic. But examine the deeper pattern. Brutus was a man who defined himself through philosophical purity, through his connection to the idealized Roman Republic that no longer existed. His identity required Caesar to be a tyrant, even when Caesar repeatedly showed him personal favor and clemency. Caesar had forgiven Brutus for fighting against him in the Civil War. He elevated him to positions of honor. He treated him, by many accounts, as a son. But none of this mattered. Brutus's self-conception as the guardian of republican virtue required Caesar to be the monster. His grievance against tyranny, real or imagined, was so central to his identity that he could not perceive Caesar except through that lens. The man who showered him with favor had to become, in his mind, the enemy of everything he stood for. On the Ides of March, when Brutus drove his blade into Caesar's body, he was not striking a tyrant. He was preserving his own narrative. The grievance demanded it. The identity required it. Caesar's famous words, "Et tu, Brute," capture the profound shock of recognizing this pattern too late. Even Caesar, one of history's most astute observers of human nature, misjudged the depth of Brutus's commitment to his grievance. Now transport this dynamic into the modern world, for it plays out daily in countless variations. In corporate environments, the perpetually aggrieved employee is immediately recognizable. They are the one who, despite being given opportunities, despite receiving support, despite working in conditions that others navigate successfully, always has a narrative of being undermined, overlooked, or sabotaged. You might hire such a person, full of sympathy for their tales of previous employers who failed to recognize their talents. You might champion them, give them resources, open doors, and for a time they will praise you, call you different from all the others, express gratitude. But watch carefully. The pattern will reassert itself. Slowly, their narrative will begin to shift. You will notice small criticisms, innocent at first. They will begin to interpret neutral actions as slights. Your decisions will be questioned, your motives suspected. Eventually, you will become the latest chapter in their story of persecution. They will leave your company, or worse, remain while actively undermining you. And they will tell others the same story they told you about their previous employer, that they were unappreciated, that their talents were wasted, that they were betrayed by someone they trusted. The names change. The story remains identical. In personal relationships, this archetype is equally destructive. The friend who always needs consolation, who transforms every event into evidence of the world's hostility toward them, who requires you to constantly validate their victimhood. What seems like compassion to support such a person is actually complicity in a destructive pattern. Because your support does not heal them, it feeds the grievance, it confirms their worldview. And the moment you suggest they might bear some responsibility for their patterns, the moment you fail to completely validate their victim narrative, you become the enemy. Here is your arsenal against this archetype. First, learn to distinguish between someone who has experienced genuine hardship and is working through it, versus someone who has made hardship their identity. The former wants to heal and move forward. The latter wants to remain wounded because the wound provides them with meaning, attention, and an excuse for their failures. Second, observe what happens when such people succeed or receive good fortune. Do they use it as a foundation to build, or do they quickly find new grievances to replace the old ones? The perpetually aggrieved cannot tolerate sustained contentment. They will sabotage their own success to return to familiar emotional territory. Third, and most importantly, do not mistake their initial warmth and gratitude toward you as genuine loyalty. It is temporary, it is conditional on you perfectly fulfilling the role of savior in their narrative. The moment you become human, the moment you have needs of your own or limitations you cannot transcend, you will be reclassified. The blade is already forged. It is only waiting for the right moment to strike. Machiavelli would tell you, observe without judgment, but act with clarity. You need not be cruel to such people. You need not expose or attack them. Simply never place your welfare, your secrets, or your future in their hands. For their hands are already occupied with their grievances, and there is no room there for your trust. The second shadow, the ambitious without talent. Now we arrive at Machiavelli's second warning, and here the danger becomes more insidious, more difficult to detect. Beware, he tells us, the person whose ambition vastly exceeds their capability. The individual who hungers for recognition, status, and power, but lacks the skill, intelligence, or discipline to earn them legitimately. Why are such people dangerous? The answer reveals itself when you understand the psychology of thwarted ambition. When someone possesses both great ability and great ambition, they can achieve their goals through direct means. They can compete, excel, and rise on merit. But when ambition exists without commensurate talent, a person faces a permanent crisis. They feel they deserve more, yet cannot acquire it through performance. This creates a specific kind of desperation. That desperation seeks alternative routes to advancement, and the most common alternative, the most reliable shortcut for the ambitious but mediocre, is betrayal. They will attach themselves to those who have what they lack. They will offer loyalty, present themselves as devoted followers, play the role of the faithful subordinate. But internally, they are studying you, learning your methods, identifying your weaknesses, and waiting for the opportunity to usurp your position or claim credit for your work. Machiavelli observed this pattern throughout Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell based on the allegiances of supposedly loyal subordinates. But perhaps no case illustrates it more perfectly than that of Cesare Borgia and his hired condottieri, the mercenary captains who served him. Borgia was himself ambitious and talented, a combination Machiavelli actually admired. He hired various mercenary leaders to command his forces, promising them wealth and position. Among these was Vitellozzo Vitelli, a capable military commander who, like many condottieri, was ambitious for his own principality. Initially, Vitelli served Borgia with apparent loyalty, fighting his battles and expanding his territories. But Borgia, who understood human nature with exceptional clarity, recognized the pattern. Vitelli had ambition, but lacked the political genius and resources to create his own kingdom. His best path forward was to serve someone powerful, learn their methods, gain their trust, and then, at the opportune moment, turn that knowledge against them. He was useful, but fundamentally unreliable, because his ambition would always exceed his loyalty. Borgia's solution was characteristically ruthless and instructive. He invited Vitelli and several other potentially treacherous captains to a meeting at Senigallia under the pretense of planning their next campaign. He welcomed them with warmth and honors. Then, once they were in his power, he had them arrested. Vitelli was strangled that same night. Was this cruelty? By conventional morality, perhaps, but by Machiavellian logic, it was wisdom. Borgia understood that Vitelli's ambition made betrayal inevitable. It was not a question of if, but when. And in matters of power, acting on the inevitability before it manifests is not paranoia. It is prudence. Translate this to contemporary contexts, and you will see this archetype everywhere. In business, they are the employees who interview for positions they are unqualified for, then blame discrimination or politics when they are not selected. They are the executives who rise through networking and personal branding while producing mediocre work, constantly claiming credit for team efforts and distancing themselves from failures. I once witnessed this pattern destroy a technology startup. The founder, brilliant but overly trusting, hired a vice president of business development who spoke magnificently about strategy and growth. This VP had impressive credentials, moved in elevated circles, and presented himself as a master of corporate relationships. The founder, grateful to have someone with such apparent sophistication, granted him autonomy and visibility with investors. What the founder failed to observe was that the VP's previous ventures had all ended ambiguously. He had been at successful companies, but never central to their success. His LinkedIn profile was a masterpiece of association without accomplishment. He was, in essence, all ambition and presentation, with minimal substance. Over months, the VP began positioning himself as the real strategic mind of the company. In investor meetings, he would subtly take credit for the founder's insights. He would describe problems in ways that made him seem like the solution. He cultivated relationships with board members independent of the founder. When the company hit difficulties, as all startups do, he orchestrated a narrative in which the founder was the problem and he was the answer. The betrayal came at a board meeting where the VP, backed by investors he had carefully influenced, suggested that the company needed more experienced leadership. The founder was removed from the CEO position and offered a diminished technical role. The VP assumed control. Within a year, the company collapsed. Because ambition without talent eventually reveals itself. He could position, could politic, could betray, but he could not actually run the company. The founder's mistake was not in hiring someone ambitious. Ambition itself is not the issue. His mistake was in trusting someone whose ambition was clearly disproportionate to their demonstrated abilities. The warning signs were present from the beginning, had he known how to read them. Here is your arsenal. First, develop the ability to distinguish between confidence and competence. The ambitious without talent speak with great certainty about what should be done, but when you examine their past, you find they have not actually done difficult things themselves. They have been present where things were done. This is vastly different. Second, observe how they treat those who cannot benefit them. The talented, ambitious person is often kind to everyone because they are secure. The ambitious without talent treat people as instruments. They are charming to those who can elevate them and dismissive or cruel to those who cannot. This asymmetry is diagnostic. Third, never let such people close to your center of power, your key relationships, or your proprietary knowledge. You can work with them in limited capacities, but always maintain distance, because their ambition, lacking legitimate outlets, will inevitably seek to consume what you have built. They will study your methods not to complement them, but to replace you with themselves. Machiavelli understood that in any social hierarchy, there will be those who want to rise. This is natural. But he distinguished sharply between those who want to rise through their own excellence and those who want to rise by standing on the corpses of their benefactors. The latter are not merely competitors. They are parasites. And parasites, however much they might protest their loyalty while they feed, will always weaken their host. Identify them early, limit their access ruthlessly, and never make the mistake of thinking that your kindness, your mentorship, or your generosity will transform their nature. It will not. It will only give them more knowledge of your vulnerabilities to exploit when their moment comes. The third shadow, the ideologue. We come now to perhaps the most dangerous archetype of all, precisely because it masquerades as the most virtuous. Machiavelli warns us with particular emphasis, never trust the person who places ideology above relationship, who values abstract principles more than concrete loyalty, who would sacrifice you on the altar of their beliefs without hesitation or remorse. This archetype is treacherous because their betrayal comes wrapped in righteousness. They will destroy you and feel morally justified in doing so. They will sleep soundly after ruining you because, in their mind, they served a higher purpose. This makes them infinitely more dangerous than the simple traitor who betrays for personal gain. The greedy can be satisfied, the ambitious can be redirected. But the ideologue cannot be reasoned with, because they do not serve themselves. They serve an idea. Why does Machiavelli consider this person fundamentally untrustworthy? Because the moment you come into conflict with their ideology, you cease to be human in their eyes. You become an obstacle to truth, an enemy of justice, a representative of evil itself. And what mercy does one show to evil? What loyalty does one owe to the enemy of righteousness? Machiavelli observed this pattern most clearly in Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar, who briefly ruled Florence with prophetic fervor. Savonarola was, by all accounts, personally incorruptible. He lived in ascetic simplicity. He genuinely believed in his vision of a purified Christian republic. He spoke with such conviction that he moved thousands to tears, persuaded them to burn their art, their books, their vanities in great public pyres. But examine what happened to those who served him. His followers, convinced of their righteousness, turned on their neighbors, their friends, even their family members. If someone was accused of immorality by Savonarola's standards, and those standards were comprehensive and brutal, they became targets regardless of previous relationships. Former allies informed on each other. Sons testified against fathers, all in service of the idea. When Savonarola's prophecies failed to materialize, when his extreme positions alienated even the Pope, he did not moderate or adapt. He could not. His identity was fused with his ideology. He intensified. His rhetoric called for violent purges, threatened divine punishment. And in the end, the same people who had followed him with such devotion turned on him with equal fervor. He was arrested, tortured, and burned in the same square where he had ordered the burning of so many objects he deemed sinful. The lesson is profound. The ideologue is loyal to the idea, not to you. When the idea demands your sacrifice, you will be sacrificed. And they will do so with clear conscience because, in their moral universe, ideas supersede people. Now observe how this operates in contemporary society, for we are living through an age of intensified ideology across the political spectrum. In corporate environments, the ideologue appears as the employee who values adherence to process over outcomes, who will destroy a project or sabotage a colleague for violating procedural orthodoxy, even when that violation might have been necessary for success. Consider the case of a nonprofit organization I studied dedicated to environmental conservation. The founder had built the organization over decades, forming relationships with corporations, governments, and communities. Her approach was pragmatic: accept incremental progress, work with imperfect partners, achieve tangible environmental protections, even if they fell short of ideal outcomes. A younger executive joined the organization, brilliant and passionate, carrying the fire of absolute conviction. He believed in radical transformation, in refusing compromise, in treating corporations not as potential partners, but as inherent enemies. His ideology was pure, his vision comprehensive, and to him, the founder's pragmatism appeared as betrayal of the cause. He began a campaign within the organization, convincing other staff members that they had lost their way, that they were complicit with the very forces destroying the planet. He used the language of moral purity. He questioned the founder's integrity, not through explicit accusation, but through implication. Are we here to actually save the environment, or just to make ourselves feel better with symbolic victories? The organization split. Donors withdrew, confused by the internal conflict. Government partnerships dissolved. The founder, after giving her life to the cause, was forced out by a board, convinced that the ideologue represented authentic commitment, while she represented compromise and corruption. What happened next is instructive. Without the founder's relationships and pragmatic approach, the organization lost its effectiveness. The ideologue could inspire, could denounce, could articulate perfect visions, but he could not navigate the complex realities of actual conservation work. Within 2 years, the organization ceased to exist. The environmental lands it had been protecting were sold to developers. The ideologue had destroyed the vessel in the name of purity, and he felt no remorse, because in his framework, the organization's failure was preferable to its compromise. Better to be purely right and completely ineffective than imperfectly right and tangibly useful. This is the psychology you must understand. The ideologue experiences criticism of their ideas as personal attack, while their betrayal of you is merely principle in action. This asymmetry makes relationship with them impossible on terms of mutual loyalty. In personal relationships, the ideologue is the friend who will end decades of friendship over political disagreement. The family member who cuts off contact because you do not share their convictions about religion, social issues, or moral frameworks. They do not do this casually. They do it with pain, often. But they do it because the idea demands it. And here is what makes them particularly dangerous. They are often the most compelling people you will meet. They speak with conviction. They seem uncompromisingly authentic. They inspire others with the power of their beliefs. It is easy to be drawn to such people, to want their approval, to feel elevated by association with their certainty. Your arsenal must be calibrated carefully here. First, learn to distinguish between people who hold strong beliefs and people who are possessed by ideology. The former can disagree without disowning. They can maintain relationships across differences. They understand that humans are more than their positions on issues. The ideologue cannot make these distinctions. Everything is political, everything is moral, everything is war. Second, observe what happens when their ideas fail. Do they adapt? Do they learn? Or do they intensify, seeking external enemies to blame, purging the insufficiently committed from their circle? The ideologue responds to failure by becoming more extreme, not more moderate. Third, never believe that you are exempt from their judgment. You may agree with 99% of their positions, but the moment you diverge on the 100th, you become classified not as someone who disagrees on one issue, but as someone who has revealed themselves to be fundamentally wrong, suspect, possibly malicious. Machiavelli would counsel you thus: respect people of conviction, but keep ideologues at distance. Work with them when your goals align, but never confuse temporary alignment with permanent loyalty. Because when the moment comes that your interests diverge from their ideology, And that moment will come. They will choose the idea over you without hesitation. The betrayal will be total, and it will be justified in their mind by the highest possible motives, which means they will pursue it not with guilt, but with zeal. They will destroy you thoroughly because anything less would be moral compromise. And the ideologue does not compromise. Remember this: Savonarola burned the great works of Renaissance Florence in the name of purity. His followers informed on their neighbors in the name of righteousness. And when the moment came, those same followers watched him burn with the same moral certainty. The idea, you see, was never about him. He was merely an instrument, and instruments, when they cease to serve, are discarded. You are an instrument too in the eyes of the ideologue, useful when you advance the idea, disposable when you do not. Plan accordingly. The inflection point, the foundation, is laid. We have now established the fundamental architecture of Machiavellian distrust. You have learned to identify 3 of the 7 shadows: the perpetually aggrieved, who require enemies to sustain their identity; the ambitious without talent, who must betray to rise; and the ideologue, who serves ideas rather than people. These 3 archetypes share a common feature. They are structurally incapable of loyalty because their primary allegiance lies elsewhere. The perpetually aggrieved is loyal to their grievance. The ambitious without talent is loyal to their hunger for status. The ideologue is loyal to their ideology. In each case, you are, at best, a means to an end, and means can be discarded when they cease to be useful. But recognize something crucial. These first 3 types are, in a sense, defensively oriented. They betray you when you cease to serve their needs, when you disappoint their expectations, when you conflict with their framework. Their treachery is reactive, triggered by circumstances that place you in opposition to their primary loyalty. The next 4 archetypes operate differently. These are offensively oriented betrayers. They do not wait for you to disappoint them. They actively seek to exploit, manipulate, and ultimately destroy you as part of their fundamental strategy for existence. They are not reacting to you. They are hunting you. This is more difficult terrain. The first 3 shadows, once you understand their psychology, are relatively easy to spot. They announce themselves through patterns of complaint, visible incompetence paired with outsized confidence, or rigid ideological pronouncements. They leave traces. But what follows is subtler. The remaining 4 archetypes are masters of concealment. They understand that their effectiveness depends on not being recognized. They have studied human psychology intuitively or deliberately, and they know how to present themselves in ways that disarm your defenses. They exploit your generosity, your empathy, your desire to think the best of people. Machiavelli identified these types through years of observation in the most treacherous political environments Europe had ever produced. He watched principalities fall not to armies, but to courtiers. He witnessed rulers destroyed not by rebellion, but by the calculated treachery of those they had elevated to positions of intimacy and power. What you are about to learn is not comfortable knowledge. It will fundamentally alter how you view certain relationships. You will recognize people you currently trust. You may see patterns in your own past betrayals that you previously attributed to bad luck or misunderstanding, but which actually followed precise psychological laws. This recognition carries a price. Once you can see these patterns, you cannot pretend not to see them. Once you understand these dynamics, you bear the responsibility of acting on that understanding. Some of you will wish you had never acquired this knowledge. But I would argue that ignorance is not peace. It is simply vulnerability disguised as innocence. The defenses you have already built, learning to keep the aggrieved at arm's length, limiting the access of the talentless ambitious, refusing to grant ideologues authority over your life, these are fundamental. But they are not sufficient. The shadows that remain are darker precisely because they are more sophisticated. They have adapted to suspicion. They have learned to mimic loyalty convincingly. They understand the language of trust and can speak it fluently while meaning none of it. But they can still be detected. Their patterns can still be recognized, and once recognized, their power diminishes radically. Because their effectiveness depends entirely on your blindness. Illuminate them, and they become manageable. Continue in darkness, and they will devour everything you build. Are you prepared to go deeper? To learn not just how to identify the reactive betrayer, but the proactive predator? To understand not just those who might betray you under pressure, but those who are planning your exploitation from the moment they meet you? This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. This is the accumulated wisdom of centuries of observation about how certain types of people operate consistently, predictably, across all cultures and all time periods. Machiavelli did not invent these archetypes. He merely named what had always existed. The choice before you is simple but consequential. You can close this video now, take comfort in the defenses you have already learned, and navigate the world with partial sight. Or you can continue, acquire complete vision, and accept the burden of seeing clearly. The next 4 laws are not for everyone. They require you to abandon certain comfortable illusions about human nature. They demand that you accept that some people enter your life with calculated intention to harm you, not because you have wronged them, but simply because that is how they relate to the world. If you have chosen to continue, then steel yourself. We are about to enter the domain of the master manipulators, the ones who smile while they sharpen their knives, the ones who embrace you while calculating exactly where to strike. This is the territory of advanced betrayal, and Machiavelli, who survived it, will be our guide. The 4th shadow, the flatterer. Now we enter more dangerous waters. Machiavelli reserves particular contempt for this archetype, and with good reason. The flatterer is perhaps the most common source of a leader's downfall, a friend's betrayal, or a family's destruction. Yet they are also the most welcomed into inner circles. Why? Because they tell us exactly what we most want to hear. The flatterer is dangerous, not because they lie about facts, but because they lie about you. They reflect back an image of yourself that is more impressive, more capable, more righteous than reality. And humans, being fundamentally insecure creatures, despite our pretensions, hunger for this false reflection. We crave it. We become addicted to it. And in that addiction, we grant power to those who provide it. Machiavelli understood that every person, no matter how intelligent or self-aware, has blind spots about themselves. We need external feedback to calibrate our self-perception. This creates a dependency. We rely on others to tell us when we are making mistakes, when our plans are flawed, when our behaviors are destructive. The flatterer exploits this dependency by providing feedback that is systematically distorted in your favor. But here is the critical insight. The flatterer does not serve you through their praise. They serve themselves. They are purchasing access, influence, and eventually control through the currency of your ego. Every false compliment is an investment. Every unwarranted praise is a deposit in an account they plan to withdraw from when the moment is right. Consider the case of Louis XV of France and his courtiers, a situation Machiavelli observed directly. Louis was, by many accounts, a decent man and a capable administrator, but he was surrounded by courtiers who competed to tell him what he wanted to hear. When he expressed interest in conquering Italian territories, they praised his martial genius. When he made diplomatic errors, they found ways to blame others. When his military campaigns failed, they convinced him it was bad fortune, never bad strategy. The result was predictable. Louis made increasingly poor decisions because he never received accurate feedback. His courtiers were so invested in pleasing him that they allowed him to persist in errors that a single honest advisor could have corrected. He launched expensive campaigns that wiser counsel would have prevented. He made enemies where friendship was possible and trusted traitors while suspecting loyal servants. All because the truth was suppressed by those who found agreement more profitable than honesty. When Lewis's power finally waned and he could no longer dispense favors, where were these flatterers? They had moved on, finding new targets for their praise. They had never been loyal to Louis. They had been loyal to what Louis could do for them. The moment that utility expired, so did their devotion. The modern workplace is infested with this archetype. They are the employees who praise every decision the boss makes, who laugh at jokes that are not funny, who find brilliance in mediocre ideas. To the inexperienced leader, this feels like loyalty and respect. In reality, it is manipulation and exploitation. I witnessed this pattern destroy a CEO who had built a successful technology company. In its early years, she was surrounded by people who would argue with her, who would tell her when her ideas were flawed, who valued the company's success over her ego. The company thrived because decisions were stress-tested through honest disagreement. But as the company grew and she became wealthy and powerful, the composition of her inner circle changed. The arguers were gradually replaced by agreeers. Not through any deliberate purge, but through natural selection. She found herself spending more time with people who made her feel brilliant and less time with people who challenged her. Her new CFO was a master of this art. He praised her vision constantly. In meetings, he would listen to her proposals and respond with variations of, "That's exactly right," and "I was thinking the same thing." He never contributed original ideas, but had a genius for rephrasing her ideas back to her in ways that made them sound more impressive. She came to see him as her most trusted advisor, the person who truly understood her thinking. She granted him increasing authority over the company's finances and strategy. What she did not realize was that he was using this access to position himself with the board of directors as the real source of stability in the company. When the company hit a difficult quarter, as all companies eventually do, the CFO's flattery took a darker turn. In private conversations with board members, he expressed concern about the CEO's judgment. He suggested that her bold vision, which he had always praised to her face, was actually reckless. He positioned himself as the steady hand that had been protecting the company from her excesses. The board, convinced by this narrative, removed her and installed him as CEO. Within months, it became clear he had no vision of his own. He had been a mirror, not a leader. The company stagnated under his leadership and was eventually acquired at a fraction of its peak value. The CEO's mistake was not in wanting to be respected or appreciated. These are natural human needs. Her mistake was in failing to distinguish between respect earned through achievement and flattery designed to manipulate. She confused agreement with loyalty, praise with honesty. Here is your arsenal against this archetype. First, actively cultivate relationships with people who disagree with you. Not people who are contrarian for its own sake, but people who have the courage to offer you difficult truths. These people are rare and precious. They are uncomfortable to be around because they challenge you. But they are the only ones providing you with the feedback you actually need. Second, be suspicious of anyone who never criticizes you. If someone works closely with you and agrees with you on every significant decision, one of two things is true. Either you are infallible, which you are not, or they are not being honest with you. The absence of disagreement is not a sign of harmony, it is a sign of manipulation. Third, observe how people speak about you when they think you are not listening. The flatterer is skilled at praising you to your face, but their true opinions often leak when they believe themselves unobserved. If you hear through reliable sources that someone who praises you constantly is speaking about you differently in private, you have identified a flatterer. Fourth, test people periodically by deliberately expressing an obviously flawed idea and observing their response. If someone agrees with a position you know to be wrong simply because you expressed it, they have revealed themselves. The honest person will question even ideas they typically agree with if those ideas seem poorly reasoned. Machiavelli himself provided a crucial technique for managing this threat. He advised that a prince should make it clear that he not only tolerates truth, but demands it. That disagreement, when grounded in genuine concern for the collective interest, will be rewarded rather than punished. This creates an environment where flattery becomes less effective because honest counsel is explicitly valued. But here is the deeper challenge. You must be capable of hearing truth without retribution. Many leaders claim they want honesty, but unconsciously punish those who provide it. They become defensive, argumentative, or cold toward those who challenge them. This behavior, even when subtle, teaches everyone around them that flattery is safer than honesty. The flatterer is counting on this. They are betting that your ego is more powerful than your wisdom. They are wagering that you would rather feel good than be effective. And in most cases, they win that bet. Because the uncomfortable truth is that most people, given the choice between pleasant lies and difficult truths, will choose the lies. You must be different. You must develop the capacity to separate your ego from your interests. When someone challenges your ideas, your first response should not be defensiveness, but curiosity. What are they seeing that you are missing? Even if their criticism is wrong, what caused them to perceive the situation differently? This discipline is difficult. It requires constant vigilance because the ego is always ready to reassert itself. But it is the only reliable defense against the flatterer. Because if you genuinely value truth over comfort, the flatterer has nothing to offer you. Their currency becomes worthless. And they will move on to more vulnerable targets. Remember, Machiavelli warned that the flatterer is not simply annoying or useless. They are actively destructive. They create a distorted information environment that leads you to make catastrophic errors. They isolate you from reality by constructing a bubble of false feedback. And when the inevitable consequences of poor decisions arrive, they will be nowhere to be found. Or worse, they will be positioning themselves as your replacement, explaining to others how they always had concerns but were too loyal to voice them publicly. The flatterer's betrayal is not a single dramatic act. It is a slow poisoning of your judgment, conducted through the pleasant-tasting medicine of praise. By the time you recognize what has happened, you have made decisions based on false premises, alienated honest advisors, and granted power to someone whose only skill is manipulation. Trust Machiavelli on this. Better to be surrounded by 1,000 critics who genuinely want you to succeed than by a single flatterer who profits from your failure. The fifth shadow, the chronic boundary violator. We arrive now at an archetype that Machiavelli identifies through careful observation of human behavior in confined social systems, courts, families, close political alliances. This is the person who systematically tests and transgresses boundaries, not dramatically, not with obvious malice, but persistently, incrementally, always pushing slightly beyond what is acceptable, appropriate, or agreed upon. Why does Machiavelli warn against trusting such people? Because the boundary violator is conducting reconnaissance. Each violation is a test, assessing how much they can take, how far they can push, what consequences they will face. They are not violating boundaries accidentally or through social awkwardness. They are violating boundaries strategically as part of a larger campaign to establish dominance and eliminate constraints on their behavior. The psychology is sophisticated. Most people, when they experience a boundary violation, respond with discomfort but not confrontation. The violation is small enough to seem petty if challenged. You tell yourself it is not worth making an issue over. Perhaps they did not mean it. Perhaps you are being too sensitive. The boundary violator counts on this calculation. They understand that social conditioning makes most people avoid confrontation over small violations. But here is what Machiavelli understood. Small, unchallenged violations are not the end. They are the beginning. Each successful transgression emboldens the next. Each time you fail to enforce a boundary, you teach the violator that you will not defend yourself. And they adjust their behavior accordingly, taking more, pushing further, until you wake up one day to discover that you have become subordinate in a relationship where you should have been equal or superior. Consider the historical case of Cesare Borgia's relationship with his condottiero captains, particularly in how he managed Oliverotto da Fermo. Oliverotto had initially served Borgia with apparent respect, following orders and acknowledging Borgia's authority. But Borgia, with his characteristic insight into human nature, noticed something. Oliverotto was constantly testing small boundaries. He would arrive slightly late to meetings. He would offer opinions without being asked, subtly positioning himself as more of an equal than a subordinate. He would appropriate slightly more resources than allocated, always with plausible explanations. These violations were individually minor. Any single instance could be dismissed or explained away. But the pattern revealed something crucial. Oliverotto was assessing whether Borgia was the kind of leader who would enforce his authority or the kind who could be gradually undermined. He was preparing for eventual rebellion by testing whether Borgia had the will to punish transgression. Borgia's response was characteristically decisive. Rather than address each minor violation individually, which would have seemed petty and would have revealed his awareness of the pattern, he took action on a larger scale. He invited Oliverotto and other potentially treacherous captains to the trap at Senigallia. The boundary violator, along with his fellow conspirators, was eliminated before his reconnaissance could be completed. The modern manifestation of this archetype appears in every context where ongoing relationships exist. In business, they are the colleague who asks to borrow something and returns it damaged or late, who schedules meetings during your block time because it's urgent, who forwards your private emails without permission, who takes credit for shared work. Each instance is minor enough to seem not worth addressing, but the cumulative effect is the establishment of a dynamic where your boundaries mean nothing. A friend of mine experienced this pattern in her personal life in a way that illustrates the mechanism perfectly. She had a sister who began, after their mother's death, to make small incursions on the estate settlement. She would take items from their mother's house without consulting my friend, always with reasonable-sounding explanations. "I thought you wouldn't mind. I was going to ask, but you were busy. Mom would have wanted me to have this." My friend, still grieving and wanting to maintain family harmony, did not object to these minor takings. Each item individually was not worth an argument, but the sister was conducting an assessment. She was learning that my friend would not defend boundaries when challenged with emotional appeals or reasonable-sounding justifications. The pattern escalated. The sister began making decisions about the estate without consultation. She delayed providing financial documentation she was required to share. She created situations where confronting her would require my friend to be the difficult one, the person making family gatherings uncomfortable over small matters. By the time my friend recognized the full pattern, the sister had established effective control over significant estate assets. The final betrayal came when the sister used the access my friend's passivity had granted to redirect substantial funds to her own accounts. When confronted, her defense was revealing. "You never cared about these details before. Why does it matter now?" The boundary violator is always preparing this defense. They are establishing a history of your non-response that they can point to as evidence that you consented to their behavior. Your silence becomes retroactive permission. Your patience becomes proof of agreement. In professional contexts, this pattern is endemic. The employee who violates company policy in small ways, testing whether management will enforce rules. The business partner who makes decisions that should be joint without consultation, seeing if you will object. The vendor who delivers slightly late, slightly under specification, slightly over budget, always with explanations, always pushing to see how much deviation you will tolerate. Here is your arsenal. First, recognize that the pattern is more significant than any individual violation. Stop evaluating each boundary transgression in isolation. Look at the trend. Is this person systematically pushing against limits? Are they constantly finding themselves in situations where they need exceptions, where rules do not quite apply to them, where your preferences should be subordinated to their convenience? Second, respond to violations immediately and clearly, not with anger, not with lengthy explanations, but with firm re-establishment of the boundary. When someone takes what is not theirs, you retrieve it. When someone commits your time without permission, you decline. When someone shares what should be private, you explicitly restate the confidentiality expectation. The key is consistency. The boundary violator is looking for hesitation, for flexibility, for signals that you can be pushed. Deny them these signals. Third, understand that you will be painted as rigid, difficult, ungenerous, or petty when you enforce boundaries with such people. This is part of their strategy. They violate boundaries while maintaining a posture of casualness and trust. So your enforcement appears as an overreaction. They say things like, "I can't believe you're making such a big deal about this," or "I thought we were past this kind of formality." Do not be manipulated by this framing. The person making a big deal is the one who keeps violating boundaries, not the one enforcing them. The person introducing formality is the one whose informal behavior cannot be trusted, requiring you to become more formal for self-protection. Fourth, recognize that with the chronic boundary violator, distance is often the only solution. Some people respond to clear boundaries and adjust their behavior. But the true boundary violator, the one Machiavelli warns about, does not adjust. They simply become more sophisticated in their violations or seek other targets. If you find yourself constantly having to defend basic boundaries with someone, the relationship itself is the problem. Machiavelli observed that in political contexts, the boundary violator who survives initial boundary enforcement does not learn respect, they learn caution. They become more careful about what they can be caught doing, but their fundamental orientation remains unchanged. They are still assessing, still probing, still looking for the moment when your attention lapses or your will weakens. The wisdom here is uncomfortable because it contradicts much of what we are taught about relationships. We are told to be flexible, to assume good intentions, to not sweat the small stuff. These are reasonable guidelines for dealing with generally trustworthy people who occasionally make mistakes. But they are catastrophically wrong when applied to the chronic boundary violator. The small stuff is not small. It is reconnaissance. It is preparation. It is the establishment of a pattern that will, if unchecked, lead to major violations that you will have lost the moral and practical authority to address because you ignored the minor ones. Machiavelli would tell you, boundaries are not arbitrary rules designed to make life difficult. They are the architecture of functional relationships. They define the space where each party operates, the limits of acceptable behavior, the terms of engagement. When someone systematically violates boundaries, they are rejecting the terms of the relationship while pretending to accept them. They want the benefits of relationship without the constraints of respect. Do not trust such people with anything you cannot afford to lose. Do not grant them access to resources, information, or emotional intimacy, because they have already shown you, through their pattern of small violations, exactly what they will do with greater access. They will take more. The boundary violator's betrayal is not a surprise twist. It is the logical culmination of behavior they have been demonstrating from the beginning. Your surprise, when it comes, is simply evidence that you were not paying attention to the pattern. Machiavelli's warning is clear. Pay attention. Small violations predict large betrayals, and the person who will not respect small boundaries will not respect large ones when the opportunity arises. The sixth shadow, the victim maker. Now we approach territory that requires particular subtlety to navigate, for this archetype is among the most difficult to identify and the most dangerous when unrecognized. Machiavelli warns us about the person who has a peculiar talent. They consistently create situations where you must either harm them or harm yourself. They are the victim maker, the individual who structures interactions so that their well-being becomes your burden, their problems become your emergencies, their failures become your responsibilities. Why does Machiavelli consider this person fundamentally untrustworthy? Because their modus operandi is the systematic exploitation of your decency. They identify your sense of responsibility, your compassion, your guilt, and they weaponize these virtues against you. The relationship becomes a slowly tightening trap where your options narrow to either serving their needs at cost to yourself or refusing and accepting the role of villain in their narrative. The psychology is insidious. Unlike the obvious manipulator who demands things directly, the victim maker never quite asks. They simply create circumstances that make you feel you must offer. They present crises that seem to require your intervention. They find themselves in predicaments that appear to need your resources. And crucially, they do this with such regularity that it cannot be coincidence. It must be strategy. Machiavelli observed this pattern in the Italian politics of his era, particularly in how certain weaker city-states would constantly create situations requiring intervention from stronger ones. Florence, for instance, repeatedly found itself obligated to bail out or defend allies who had made reckless decisions, because refusing would mean abandoning them to destruction. These allies had learned that by making themselves perpetually vulnerable, they could extract resources and military support without having to offer equivalent value in return. The city of Pistoia provided a clear example. It was constantly embroiled in internal factional conflicts, each side appealing to Florence for support, each crisis threatening to destabilize the region. Florence found itself repeatedly investing resources to stabilize Pistoia, not because Pistoia was particularly valuable, but because the cost of allowing it to collapse seemed higher than the cost of intervention. But here was Machiavelli's insight. Pistoia's instability was not unfortunate circumstance, it was strategy. By remaining weak and chaotic, Pistoia ensured Florence's attention and resources. A strong, stable Pistoia would have been ignored or absorbed. A perpetually vulnerable Pistoia was perpetually relevant. The victim-making was deliberate. In contemporary life, this archetype manifests with depressing frequency. In personal relationships, they are the friend or family member who is always in crisis. Their car breaks down, their rent is overdue, their relationship is collapsing, their health is failing, and somehow each crisis arrives at your door requiring your money, your time, your emotional energy, or your direct intervention. Any single crisis would warrant help. Any decent person would assist a friend or family member in genuine need. But the victim maker is never in crisis just once. The crises are continuous, with barely enough time between them for you to recover before the next emergency arrives. And if you examine the crises carefully, you begin to notice something disturbing. They are often the predictable consequences of the victim maker's own poor decisions. They did not save money, so any unexpected expense becomes a crisis requiring your financial help. They did not maintain their relationships, so when conflicts arise, you must mediate. They did not develop skills or discipline, so their employment is perpetually unstable, requiring your network and resources to find them new positions. They did not take care of their health, so their medical emergencies become your scheduling emergencies. I observed this pattern destroy a man who had built a successful business. His brother had always been less successful, less disciplined, less capable. But the brother was family, and my friend had a strong sense of family obligation. When the brother's business failed, my friend helped him financially. When the brother's marriage collapsed, my friend provided housing. When the brother needed a job, my friend created a position for him in his company. Each intervention was justified by the specific crisis. Each time the brother expressed gratitude and promised that once he got back on his feet, he would never need help again. But the crises continued. The brother made poor decisions in the job my friend had given him, creating problems my friend had to solve. He borrowed money he did not repay. He moved into the housing my friend provided and then created conflicts with other tenants. The turning point came when my friend realized something. His brother's crises always escalated right when my friend was achieving something significant. When my friend was about to expand his business, the brother had a health crisis that consumed months of attention. When my friend was finally taking a long-planned vacation, the brother had a financial emergency that required my friend to cut the trip short. When my friend was developing a significant new client relationship, the brother created a crisis at the office that embarrassed my friend in front of the client. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The brother was not simply unlucky or incapable. He was structuring his crises to maintain my friend's attention and resources. Whether consciously or unconsciously, he had learned that being in crisis kept him central to my friend's life and gave him access to resources he could not generate himself. The victim-making was functional. The devastating realization for my friend was that helping his brother was not actually helping him. Each rescue removed consequences that might have taught the brother to make better decisions. Each intervention reinforced the brother's pattern of creating crises rather than solving problems. My friend's compassion had become an enabling force, allowing destructive patterns to continue and intensify. When my friend finally established boundaries, no more money, no more job interventions, no more emergency housing, the brother's response was revealing. He did not express understanding or commit to change. He expressed betrayal. He told other family members that my friend had abandoned him in his darkest hour. He framed my friend's boundaries as cruelty, his refusal to continue rescuing as evidence of a cold heart. This is the victim-maker's ultimate move. When you stop accepting the burden of their dysfunction, you become the villain in their story. They position your self-preservation as your moral failure. They make your boundary into evidence of your character flaw. Here is your arsenal. First, distinguish between people in temporary crisis and people in permanent crisis. The person in temporary crisis is disoriented by their situation. They did not expect it and do not know how to navigate it yet. The person in permanent crisis is oriented around crisis. It is their normal state, and they have developed sophisticated skills for managing others' responses to it. Second, observe whether your help produces improvement or simply postpones consequences. When you assist someone, do they use that assistance to build capability and stability, or do they use it to avoid making necessary changes, knowing that when the next crisis comes, you will probably help again? Third, notice the timing of crises. Are they truly random, or do they coincide with moments when you are least able to help, ensuring that helping requires sacrifice on your part? Or moments when you are achieving success, subtly redirecting attention and resources back to them? The victim maker often has uncanny timing, though they will insist it is just bad luck. Fourth, and most critically, understand that setting boundaries with the victim maker will feel cruel. They have structured the relationship so that your self-preservation requires you to abandon them. This is deliberate. The guilt you feel is the mechanism of control. If you cannot tolerate feeling like you are abandoning someone, you cannot escape the victim-maker's trap. Machiavelli would counsel you to examine the consequences of continued help versus the consequences of withdrawal. The victim-maker will insist that withdrawal means their destruction. But observe their history. Have they actually been destroyed by any of their previous crises? Or have they simply found new sources of help? In most cases, when one rescuer stops rescuing, the victim maker simply moves to the next target. Your withdrawal does not doom them. It simply forces them to either develop their own capacity or to find someone else to exploit. And the hard truth is that some people will never develop capacity as long as exploitation remains available. Your help, no matter how well-intentioned, is preventing the very growth you hope to facilitate. The victim maker is dangerous not because they are evil, but because they are effective. They have discovered a strategy that works. By making themselves perpetually vulnerable, they create an ethical obligation in others that can be exploited indefinitely. They have learned to transmute your virtues, your compassion, your loyalty, your sense of responsibility into resources they can extract. This is why Machiavelli warns against trusting them. Trust requires mutuality. It requires that both parties have investment in each other's welfare. But the victim maker has structured a unidirectional relationship. Your welfare matters only insofar as it enables you to continue supporting theirs. If you become unable to help, if you yourself face crisis, you will discover very quickly how conditional their relationship with you always was. Remember, genuine victims seek to stop being victims. They use help as a ladder to climb out of crisis. The victim maker seeks to remain a victim because the victim role provides access and control they cannot achieve through capability. Your help does not save them, it fuels them. Trust only those whose trajectory, over time, is toward greater independence and capability. Distrust those whose trajectory, despite all help received, is toward greater dependency and dysfunction. The former will be grateful for your support and will eventually reciprocate it. The latter will consume everything you offer and demand more, framing each refusal as betrayal. Machiavelli understood that in politics, the chronically weak state is often more dangerous than the openly hostile one. The hostile state you can defend against directly. The weak state becomes your responsibility, your burden, your endless obligation. The victim maker operates on the same principle, and until you recognize the pattern, you will continue to sacrifice your interests on the altar of their eternal crisis. The seventh shadow, the narcissist. We arrive now at the final and perhaps most comprehensive archetype in Machiavelli's catalog of untrustworthiness. This is the person whose fundamental psychology makes lasting loyalty not merely unlikely, but psychologically impossible. This is the narcissist, the individual who experiences other people not as separate beings with their own inherent value, but as instruments, mirrors, or obstacles in relation to their own ego. Machiavelli did not use this term, of course. The psychological framework would not be articulated for centuries. But he observed the pattern with perfect clarity. Certain people, often charming and impressive, are fundamentally unable to maintain loyal relationships because they are incapable of valuing others except in terms of utility to themselves. Why is this person uniquely dangerous? Because unlike the other archetypes we have discussed, the narcissist's betrayal is not triggered by grievance, ambition, ideology, or even calculated self-interest. It is structural. It emerges from the way they process reality itself. In their psychological universe, only one person is truly real, truly important, truly deserving of consideration. That person is themselves. Everyone else exists on a spectrum from useful to irrelevant to threatening. When you are useful to the narcissist, when you provide admiration, resources, status, or service, they will treat you with apparent warmth and regard. You may mistake this for genuine affection or loyalty, but you are experiencing something more akin to how someone appreciates a fine tool or a beautiful possession. The moment you cease to be useful, or worse, the moment you require something from them that does not serve their interests, you will discover the truth. You were never a person to them. You were always a function, Machiavelli observed. This pattern most clearly in Cesare Borgia himself, whom he both studied intensely and, in some ways, admired. Borgia was brilliant, charismatic, strategic, and utterly without genuine loyalty to anyone. He elevated people when they served him and discarded them without hesitation when they did not. His closest allies learned that proximity to Borgia was always temporary. You were in favor until you were not, and the transition could be instant and fatal. But here is what made Borgia a useful case study for Machiavelli. Borgia's narcissism was transparent and operational. He made no pretense of deep personal loyalty. Everyone understood that relationships with him were transactional. In a perverse way, this honesty made him manageable. People knew what they were dealing with. The truly dangerous narcissist is the one who has learned to simulate emotional depth, who has mastered the performance of loyalty and affection while feeling neither. These individuals have studied what authentic connection looks like and can reproduce its external features convincingly. They know the words that signal care. They can produce tears that appear genuine. They can express gratitude, vulnerability, and devotion in ways that seem real because they have learned that these performances grant them access and control. In contemporary contexts, the narcissist often rises to prominence precisely because their self-assurance and charm are compelling. They interview brilliantly because they have no anxiety about self-promotion. They genuinely believe they are exceptional. They enter relationships with intensity and confidence because they have no doubt about their own desirability. They make bold claims and promises because consequences feel abstract to them. Only their current desires feel real. Consider a case I studied involving a nonprofit organization founded to address childhood poverty. The founder was charismatic, eloquent, and apparently deeply committed to the cause. She spoke movingly about her own difficult childhood and her determination to help other children escape similar circumstances. Donors were inspired. Staff were devoted. The organization grew rapidly, but over time a pattern emerged. The organization's work was perpetually subordinated to the founder's personal brand. Resources that should have gone to programs were redirected to her speaking tours, her book projects, her media appearances. Staff who questioned these priorities were framed as not truly committed to the mission. Board members who raised concerns about financial management found themselves isolated and eventually pushed out. The founder insisted that the organization's success depended on her visibility and influence. And there was truth in this. Her charisma was attracting resources, but the organization was becoming a vehicle for her ego rather than a vehicle for the mission. The children it was supposedly serving were becoming props in her personal narrative of redemption and impact. The crisis came when investigative journalists discovered that very little money was actually reaching the children. Most resources were going to operations, which meant primarily salaries and expenses for the founder and her inner circle, and to marketing, which meant elevating the founder's profile. When confronted, the founder's response was revealing. She did not express remorse or commitment to reform. She expressed outrage that anyone would question her motives. She framed the criticism as an attack not just on her, but on all the children she was helping. She positioned herself as the victim of a conspiracy by people who wanted to see the organization fail. This is the narcissist's signature move. When caught or confronted, they do not accept responsibility. They cannot. Because in their psychological framework, they are incapable of being fundamentally wrong. So the problem must be external. The critics are motivated by jealousy, misunderstanding, or malice. The consequences of their actions are reframed as evidence of others' failures or persecution of themselves. The organization collapsed. The founder moved on to a new venture, carrying the same patterns with her. And the people who had dedicated years to what they thought was a genuine mission were left to process the realization that they had been instruments in someone else's ego project. In personal relationships, the narcissist follows a predictable cycle that researchers have termed Idealize, devalue, discard, though Machiavelli would have recognized the pattern without the terminology. Initially, you are idealized. The narcissist sees in you something they need: admiration, service, status by association, or simply entertainment. During this phase, they can be extraordinarily attentive and charming. You feel seen, valued, special. But this idealization is not based on truly knowing you. It is based on what you represent to them in that moment. And because it is not rooted in genuine understanding or valuation of your actual self, it is inherently unstable. Eventually, you will fail to perfectly mirror their idealized image. You will have needs of your own. You will set boundaries. You will be unavailable when they want attention. And when this happens, you are devalued. The devaluation can be subtle or overt. They may begin to criticize you, suddenly finding flaws they never mentioned before. They may become cold or dismissive. They may triangulate, comparing you unfavorably to others. The warmth that seemed so genuine vanishes, and you are left confused about what you did wrong. What you did wrong was stop being perfectly useful. And for the narcissist, this is unforgivable. Not because they are consciously cruel, but because in their psychological framework, your failure to serve their needs is a kind of betrayal. They gave you the honor of their attention, and you squandered it by having your own requirements. The discard comes when they have secured a new source of supply, someone else who can provide the admiration or service they need, or when you have become more trouble than you are worth in their calculation. They will leave without the emotional processing that characterizes normal relationship endings. There will be no genuine accountability, no authentic remorse, no real attempt to understand what happened. There may be performances of these things if such performances serve their interests, but they will ring hollow because they are hollow. Here is your arsenal, and it must be comprehensive because the narcissist is the most adaptive of all these archetypes. First, observe the pattern of idealization. When someone is excessively complimentary, excessively attentive, excessively interested in you early in a relationship, be cautious. Genuine regard builds over time through mutual knowledge. Instant, intense connection is often projection. They are relating not to who you actually are, but to who they need you to be. Second, notice how they speak about previous relationships and associates. The narcissist's history is typically littered with people who betrayed them, disappointed them, or never understood them. They will tell you these stories, positioning themselves as the perpetual victim of others' failures. What they are actually revealing is the pattern of their own idealization and discard cycle. You are hearing about your own future. Third, observe how they respond to boundaries, criticism, or your own needs. The narcissist will react to these not with negotiation or compromise, but with punishment. They may withdraw affection, employ silent treatment, become suddenly critical, or create drama that forces you to focus on managing their reaction rather than maintaining your boundary. This is conditioning. They are training you that your boundaries are not acceptable. Fourth, assess whether the relationship has genuine mutuality. In a healthy relationship, both parties give and receive, support, and are supported, listen, and are listened to. The narcissist creates relationships where you are constantly giving, supporting, and listening while they are constantly receiving, being supported, and speaking. They may perform reciprocity occasionally, but the overall pattern is unidirectional. Fifth, and most critically, understand that you cannot fix, heal, or change the narcissist through your love, patience, or insight. This is perhaps the most painful truth to accept. Many people remain in destructive relationships with narcissists because they believe that if they just love them enough, understand them enough, support them enough, the narcissist will finally reciprocate authentically. This will not happen. Not because the narcissist is evil, but because they are psychologically structured in a way that makes such reciprocity impossible. You are asking someone to do something they are fundamentally incapable of doing. Machiavelli would tell you that the narcissist is perhaps the most dangerous of all these archetypes precisely because they are often the most attractive. They have cultivated charm, confidence, and charisma because these tools grant access to the admiration and resources they crave. They are often found in positions of leadership not because they are the most competent, but because they are the most assured and the most skilled at self-promotion. The betrayal by the narcissist is particularly devastating because it often comes after a period of intense connection. You believed you were special to them. You believed the relationship was unique. You invested deeply. And then you discover that you were simply the latest in a series of people who served a function and were discarded when that function was no longer needed. Trust only those who demonstrate consistent empathy, who can apologize genuinely when they cause harm, who maintain relationships even with people who can no longer benefit them, who speak about past relationships with nuance rather than absolute judgment. These qualities indicate the capacity for authentic connection rather than performative connection. Distrust those who need to be the center of attention, who cannot tolerate criticism without retaliation, who have a trail of destroyed relationships behind them, who frame every conflict as others' failure to understand or appreciate them. These patterns indicate narcissistic psychology, and narcissistic psychology is fundamentally incompatible with loyalty. Machiavelli understood that in the struggle for power, the narcissist is sometimes a useful ally in specific contexts because their ambition and lack of emotional encumbrance can make them effective in ruthless situations. But he would never suggest trusting them, because the moment your utility ends, so does any semblance of loyalty. In your personal life, where trust is not tactical but essential, the narcissist is catastrophic. They will consume your energy, your resources, your emotional capacity. They will leave you depleted and confused, questioning your own perception of reality because their version of events is always self-serving and often contradicts your direct experience. The only winning move is not to play. Recognize the patterns early, maintain distance, protect your core resources and relationships, and never make the mistake of thinking that you are different, that you can be the one person who reaches them, who matters to them, who changes them. Others before you thought the same. They were wrong, you will be too. This is Machiavelli's final warning. The narcissist wears the mask of humanity, but operates by different rules. They speak the language of connection, but feel only utility. They promise loyalty, but deliver only performance. Recognize them, keep them at distance, and reserve your trust for those who have demonstrated, through years of consistent behavior, that they can value others as more than instruments of their own ego. The synthesis, Machiavelli's gift. We have walked through all 7 shadows now, from the perpetually aggrieved who require enemies, to the ambitious without talent who require betrayal, to the ideologue who requires submission, to the flatterer who requires your blindness, to the boundary violator who requires your passivity, to the victim maker who requires your sacrifice, and finally to the narcissist who requires your subordination. 7 distinct patterns of untrustworthiness, each operating according to its own psychological logic, each reliably producing betrayal. What Machiavelli offers you through this catalog is not cynicism, but clarity. He is not suggesting that all people are untrustworthy or that no genuine loyalty exists. Rather, he is providing you with a diagnostic framework for distinguishing between those who can be trusted and those who cannot. Most betrayals are not surprises to the trained eye. They are the predictable outcomes of recognizable patterns. The person who betrays you has typically been demonstrating their untrustworthiness for a long time through smaller actions, through consistent patterns, through the fundamental orientation of their character. The shock you feel is not because the betrayal was unforeseeable. It is because you were not looking at the evidence correctly. This knowledge transforms how you allocate trust. Trust becomes not a default position you extend to everyone until they prove unworthy, but a valuable resource you grant carefully to those who have demonstrated, through patterns over time, that they possess the psychological architecture for loyalty. The person who can be trusted possesses certain qualities that distinguish them from these 7 archetypes. They take responsibility for their own conditions rather than perpetually blaming others. They have sufficient talent to pursue their ambitions through legitimate means. They can hold beliefs without demanding others conform to them. They provide honest feedback even when it is uncomfortable. They respect boundaries consistently. They work to solve their own problems rather than making them others' emergencies. And they demonstrate consistent empathy and reciprocity. These qualities are rare. Genuinely trustworthy people are rare. This is not pessimism, it is realism. And recognizing this rarity helps you appreciate such people when you find them and protect those relationships with appropriate care. Machiavelli wrote from exile, having been tortured and stripped of power because he trusted the wrong people. His warnings are written in the language of experience and pain. He is not theorizing about betrayal. He is documenting it. He is offering you the lessons. He offers you the map of the minefield only after he has walked it himself. By internalizing these 7 shadows, you stop being a casualty of other people's nature and become a sovereign observer of it. The ultimate goal of this synthesis is not to make you paranoid, but to make you invincible to deception. When you strip away the illusions of those who would use you, you are left with the only thing that truly matters: reality. And in reality, knowing who not to trust is the foundation upon which true loyalty is built. This is the Machiavellian gift, the freedom to see the world not as you wish it to be, but exactly as it is, and to survive it with your integrity intact. Don't forget to give a like or a hype, and subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video to complete everything you just learned.